He was just replacing the roof tiles on his parents' house, but under the roof, he found something that had been deliberately hidden for decades. Several bags, old locks, and a truth that required calling in the FBI. Watch this video to find out what was hidden and by whom. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Ethan Blake did not feel grief in the way he had expected to when he turned off the two-lane highway and drove onto the narrow road that led to the house. There was no rush of memories, no tightening in his chest, no sudden urge to stop the car and breathe. There was only a quiet, stubborn heaviness, as if something had settled inside him and refused to move. The house stood where it always had, at the edge of town, half hidden by overgrown trees and a fence that leaned inward like a tired spine. It looked smaller than he remembered, not because it had changed, but because he had. He parked the car and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the ticking of hot metal as it cooled. The silence around him was deep and rural, broken only by insects and the distant bark of a dog. This was the same silence that had surrounded the house when his father vanished decades earlier. The same silence that had wrapped itself around his mother afterward and never quite let go. Ethan stepped out and walked slowly toward the front door. The paint was cracked, the porch boards bowed under his weight, and the door frame bore a long, thin split that had not been there when he was a child. Time had not damaged the house violently. It had simply worn it down, patiently, the way water wears stone. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. The furniture remained, arranged exactly as his mother had left it, as if she had only stepped out for an afternoon walk and never returned. He moved through the rooms without stopping, his footsteps echoing faintly. The house felt less like a place of memory than a container, something that had been sealed and left untouched. In the back room, where his father's boots had once stood by the wall, there was now only an empty space and a faint outline in the dust. Ethan noticed it without reaction. He had learned long ago that noticing did not require feeling. The roof, however, demanded attention. Even from the yard, he could see the uneven line of the old slate tiles, some darkened by age, others pale, where repairs had been made decades apart. The roof had never been replaced, only patched when leaks became impossible to ignore. Hiring contractors would have been the sensible choice, but Ethan dismissed the idea almost immediately. He did not want strangers crawling over the house, lifting pieces of it, asking questions. More than that, he wanted something solid to focus on, something that required his hands and his attention. The next morning, he climbed the ladder with tools strapped to his belt, the slate cold beneath his gloves. Working alone suited him. The repetitive rhythm of removing damaged tiles and fitting replacements steadied his thoughts. Hours passed unnoticed as the sun climbed higher. It was only when he reached the section near the roof's ridge that something felt wrong. A cluster of tiles sat slightly higher than the rest, their edges misaligned by a margin too precise to be accidental. Wind could loosen tiles, age could warp them, but this was different. Ethan pressed down gently with his hand. The tile shifted, not freely, but as if resting on something solid beneath it. He hesitated, then pried one tile loose. Beneath it was not bare wood or insulation, but a layer of old felt that had been carefully cut and folded back. His pulse quickened, though he could not have said why. He removed another tile, then another, until a narrow opening appeared, revealing boards laid crosswise beneath the roofline. They were not structural supports. They were deliberate. Ethan widened the opening, dust spilling down into the attic space below. When he pulled one of the boards aside, a dark cavity opened before him, deeper than it should have been. He leaned closer, the smell of old fabric and metal reaching him even before his eyes adjusted. Inside, packed tightly together, were 5 bulky shapes wrapped in coarse burlap. Thick straps bound them, each secured with metal clasps, dulled by age, but unmistakably industrial, even military in their design. For a long moment, Ethan simply stared. The world around him narrowed to the sound of his own breathing and the rough texture of the burlap beneath his fingers. The weight of the sacks was evident even without lifting them. These were not tools, not keepsakes, not anything that belonged in the roof of a family home. A memory surfaced uninvited. His father standing in the yard, looking up at the roof after a storm, saying nothing, his expression unreadable. At the time, Ethan had thought nothing of it. Now, the recollection settled uneasily into place. He forced himself not to draw conclusions. Houses accumulated strange things over decades. Previous owners hid items. Renovations concealed forgotten spaces. There were explanations that did not involve the past he had spent most of his life avoiding. Still, he knew better than to open the sacks where he stood. Whatever they contained, they had been hidden carefully and deliberately. Exposing them on the roof felt wrong, reckless. Lowering them was slow, exhausting work. He rigged a simple pulley system, lowering each sack to the ground with careful control. They landed heavily on the grass, thudding dully, their weight more apparent with each descent. By the time the fifth sack reached the ground, Ethan's arms ached, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. He covered them with an old tarp and climbed down, standing in the yard as he looked at the lumpy shapes beneath the fabric. The house loomed behind him, its roof now partially exposed, the opening above like an unblinking eye. For the first time since his return, Ethan felt something close to unease. Not fear, exactly, but the awareness that he had crossed an invisible line. That night, sleep came only in fragments. The house creaked softly as it cooled, sounds that had once been familiar, now sharp and intrusive. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the sacks outside, of the metal clasps, of the careful way the boards had been laid. He thought of his father's disappearance, of the official letters, the sealed reports, the way questions had been discouraged without ever being explicitly forbidden. By morning, he had decided what to do next. He would not leave the house. He would not call anyone. Not yet. First, he needed to see what had been hidden above his head all these years. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the yard, Ethan pulled the tarp back and prepared to open the first sack, unaware that the quiet isolation of the house was already beginning to fracture, and that what lay inside would ensure it could never be silent again. Morning light revealed the sacks more clearly than the dim awareness of night had allowed. The burlap was stiff with age, fibers rough and brittle, the fabric darkened in places by old oil stains, and something darker that Ethan did not try to identify. He dragged them one by one into the garage, choosing the space without consciously deciding. The garage had always been his father's domain. If there was anywhere the truth should surface, it was there. The garage smelled of rust, dust, and motor oil. Tools still hung on the wall in careful order, untouched for decades, their outlines marked by lighter patches where sunlight had not reached. The workbench stood against the far wall, scarred by use, its surface cleared except for a thin layer of dust. Ethan wiped it down with a rag, not out of necessity but habit, as if preparing a place for something that demanded respect. He locked the garage door behind him and pulled down the shade on the small window. The daylight dimmed to a muted glow. Only then did he turn his attention fully to the sacks. The metal clasps resisted at first. They were not simple fasteners, but reinforced closures, the kind designed to endure transport and stress. Ethan fetched bolt cutters from the wall, noting absently that they were the same ones his father had once used. The first cut snapped loudly in the enclosed space, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. He paused, listening, half expecting someone to be standing outside, half hoping he was still alone. When he loosened the burlap and peeled it back, The smell intensified. Inside the first sack, wrapped carefully in oil-soaked cloth, lay the components of a firearm. Ethan recognized the design immediately, though it lacked serial numbers or identifying marks. Each piece had been cleaned, preserved, and packed with meticulous attention. This was not the careless hiding of a criminal dumping evidence. It was storage. He laid the parts out on the workbench, aligning them instinctively. His hands moved with a familiarity that surprised him, muscle memory inherited from watching his father long ago. When the full shape emerged, incomplete but unmistakable, Ethan felt a tightness in his chest that he could not name. The weapon had been stripped of identity, rendered anonymous, but its purpose remained clear. The second sack yielded more items, smaller, but no less unsettling. Metal tags clinked softly as he poured them onto the bench. Military dog tags, some intact, others scratched, names partially ground away. There were patches as well, insignia removed from uniforms, their edges frayed where they had been torn loose. Ethan turned one tag over and over in his fingers. The erasure was deliberate, careful enough to leave no clear trace, yet not so thorough as to destroy the metal entirely. Someone had wanted these men to exist and not exist at the same time. By the time he opened the third sack, the sense of pattern had become impossible to ignore. Folded maps filled the space, their creases softened by repeated handling. They were marked with symbols Ethan did not recognize, routes drawn in pencil, coordinates circled and annotated. These were not standard military maps. They were personal, improvised, created by people who needed to understand terrain that official charts either did not show or intentionally obscured. Ethan spread them out across the workbench and the floor, piecing together fragments of a larger picture. Certain locations appeared repeatedly, linked by arrows and notes. Dates were written in the margins, some crossed out, others underlined heavily. He did not know what they meant, but he could see that they belonged together, parts of a single operation rather than isolated actions. The fourth sack was heavier than the others. Inside, he found a sealed metal container, its lid screwed tight. He worked it open slowly, his hands unsteady now despite his efforts to remain calm. Inside were rolls of photographic film, carefully wrapped, preserved against moisture. The weight of the container had come not from the metal, but from the burden of what it carried. Ethan set up the old equipment stored in the garage, surprised to find it still functional. As the first images emerged in the chemical bath, shapes forming gradually on the paper, he leaned closer, his breath shallow. The photographs depicted men in uniform, but not the kind shown in official portraits. They stood in rough terrain, near makeshift camps, beside vehicles bearing no markings. The angles were informal, candid, taken by someone inside the group rather than an observer. Then he saw his father. The recognition was immediate and undeniable. The man in the photograph was older than the memory Ethan carried, his face leaner, lines etched by strain. But the eyes were the same, alert, guarded, watching something beyond the frame. The date scribbled on the back of the photograph made Ethan's stomach drop. It was the same date that had been printed on the letter, declaring his father missing, presumed dead. Ethan sat heavily on a stool, the photograph trembling in his hand. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing inward. His father had been alive, not just alive but present, active, involved in something that had never been spoken of. He did not open the fifth sack immediately. It stood apart from the others, its shape more rigid, its contents arranged with a different intention. He paced the garage, trying to slow his breathing, trying to reconcile the images on the bench with the man he remembered. The silence pressed on him, broken only by the distant hum of insects outside. When he finally cut the clasps and folded back the burlap, He did so with deliberate care. Inside lay a video cassette, its label blank, alongside a thick folder and a sealed envelope. His name was written on the envelope in careful, familiar handwriting. Ethan stared at it for a long time without touching it. The sight of his own name, written by a hand he had not seen since childhood, felt more intimate than any of the weapons or photographs. Whatever was inside that envelope had been meant for him specifically, not for authorities, not for history, but for a son left behind. He placed the envelope gently on the workbench and closed the folder without opening it. The cassette remained untouched. There was an order to these things, a sequence that demanded respect. For now, it was enough to know that the house had not merely sheltered objects, but a message, preserved patiently through decades of silence. As the afternoon light shifted and the garage grew darker, Ethan became aware of a new sensation, subtle but persistent. The feeling that the isolation he had relied upon was no longer guaranteed. The sacks had been hidden well, but not forgotten. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase traces, yet enough had remained to point unmistakably toward something larger, something unfinished. He locked the garage and returned to the house, carrying the envelope with him. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size. That night, as he sat alone at the kitchen table, the envelope unopened before him, Ethan understood that the discovery on the roof had not been an ending, but an opening. The truth had been waiting patiently, and now that he had uncovered it, it would not allow itself to be ignored. Ethan did not open the envelope immediately. It lay on the kitchen table where he had placed it the night before, aligned carefully with the edge, as though it were an object that could be measured, controlled, reduced to a simple rectangle of paper. Morning light fell across it through the dusty window, illuminating his name written in his father's hand. That handwriting had once appeared on grocery lists, on notes left by the door, on the margins of old notebooks. Seeing it now, after so many years, unsettled him more deeply than the weapons or photographs ever could. He made coffee and drank it standing up, staring at the envelope as if it might change on its own. The house was quiet, but no longer neutral. It felt alert, aware of what had been uncovered within its walls. Every creak of wood sounded deliberate. Every shadow seemed to pause longer than it should. Ethan realized that he had crossed another threshold. The discovery itself had been shocking, but the letter was personal. Whatever was written inside had been intended for this moment, for him, and for no one else. When he finally sat down and slid a finger beneath the flap, he did so slowly, almost ceremonially. The paper inside was thick, folded neatly, its edges softened by age. As he unfolded it, the faint smell of old ink rose, carrying with it a sense of careful restraint. His father had never been a man of unnecessary words. Ethan expected the same now. The letter began without apology. His father wrote that if Ethan was reading this, then the house had finally given up what it had been holding, and the time for silence had ended. He explained that the operation he had been part of was never what it appeared to be on paper. It had been presented as a strategic mission, a necessary intervention framed in language of duty and national interest. In reality, it was a cover for something else entirely. The unit had been assembled not for combat, but for logistics. They were tasked with securing assets, moving them quietly, and ensuring that no trace of their origin remained. At first, his father wrote, most of the men had accepted this without question. Orders were orders. But as the operation unfolded, it became clear that the assets were not weapons or intelligence, but people, artifacts, and evidence that should never have been removed or erased. Witnesses disappeared. Records were altered. Reports were rewritten before they were even filed. Those who questioned the process were reassigned, isolated, or marked as liabilities. His father admitted that he had not resisted immediately. He had told himself that he was protecting his family by doing his job, that the details were not his responsibility. That illusion did not survive long. One night, he witnessed the execution of a local intermediary who had served his purpose and outlived his usefulness. The man had begged, not for mercy, but for his family to be spared the consequences of his involvement. No promises were made. From that moment, the letter said, his father knew there would be no clean ending. The operation could not be completed without erasing the people who carried it out. The official narrative would require casualties, disappearances, and convenient heroes. He realized that returning home as himself would draw attention, questions, scrutiny that could not be deflected forever. He wrote about the choice he had made. Disappearing was not an act of cowardice, but containment. By allowing himself to be declared missing, presumed dead, he removed his family from immediate danger. The house, ordinary and unremarkable, became the only place he trusted to hold the truth. The roof, repaired and neglected over the years, provided a hiding place no one would think to examine closely. Ethan read the letter twice, then a third time, absorbing each sentence until the words blurred. His hands were steady, but something inside him shifted irreversibly. The father he had mourned, resented, and mythologized was suddenly present again, not as a memory, but as a voice, calm and deliberate, explaining a reality far more complex than the one Ethan had grown up with. He moved on to the folder next. The documents inside were dense, methodical, and chilling in their precision. There were copies of orders bearing signatures that appeared nowhere in public records. There were reports stamped and re-stamped with different classifications, dates altered, names removed. Ethan began to understand how thoroughly the past could be edited. These were not the chaotic traces of a conspiracy unraveling, but the residue of a system that had functioned efficiently and without oversight. As he cross-referenced names from the documents with the photographs and maps, patterns emerged. Certain individuals appeared repeatedly, their roles shifting over time. Some had been field operatives, others coordinators. A few names appeared only once, then vanished entirely. Ethan realized that these were the ones who had not survived, not physically, but administratively. They had been erased. The video cassette remained. Ethan hesitated before inserting it into the old player he had retrieved from storage. The machine whirred uncertainly before the image flickered to life. The footage was grainy, the sound uneven, but the content was unmistakable. His father appeared briefly, off to one side of the frame, listening as others spoke. Voices discussed timelines, contingencies, and the need to ensure that certain outcomes remained permanent. Names were mentioned casually, without ceremony, as if the fate attached to them were already decided. Ethan stopped the tape several times, replaying sections, committing faces and voices to memory. These were not faceless villains. They were men who spoke calmly, professionally, confident in their authority. The absence of emotion was more disturbing than anger would have been. When the tape ended, the room felt smaller. Ethan sat back, his thoughts racing. The materials he now possessed were not merely historical artifacts. They were active evidence, capable of altering narratives that had been accepted for decades. And that realization carried weight. Someone, somewhere, would still have an interest in keeping these truths buried. As if summoned by the thought, Ethan noticed movement outside the window. A car idled briefly on the street, its engine low and patient. When he stepped closer to look, it drove away without haste. The timing felt wrong, too precise to dismiss. He told himself it was coincidence, but the reassurance rang hollow. That evening, as darkness fell, Ethan became acutely aware of the vulnerability of the house. It had protected the truth once by remaining unnoticed. Now that protection was gone. The silence that had defined the place for so long had been broken, and with it came the risk of being heard. He locked the doors, checked the windows, and returned to the kitchen table where the letter lay unfolded. The final lines echoed in his mind. His father had written that truth did not belong to one person, but responsibility did. If Ethan chose to reveal what had been hidden, there would be consequences. If he chose to remain silent, those consequences would simply be deferred, transferred to someone else. As Ethan extinguished the lights and prepared for another restless night, he understood that the discovery under the roof had reached its true depth. The past was no longer content to remain a story told by absence. It was pressing forward, demanding acknowledgement, and it would not stop at explanation alone. Ethan woke before dawn, not because of a sound, but because of the absence of one. The house, which had creaked and sighed all night, seemed to be holding its breath. He lay still, listening, his senses sharpened by the quiet tension that had settled into him since the previous evening. The images from the videotape lingered behind his eyes, the voices replaying with unsettling clarity. He knew, even before getting out of bed, that something had shifted. The truth was no longer inert. It was active now. He dressed quickly and moved through the house, checking doors and windows with a care he had not practiced before. Everything appeared intact. The locks were secure, the glass unbroken. Yet the feeling persisted, a low pressure at the base of his skull, urging him to look closer, to question what he might otherwise ignore. When he stepped outside, the air was cool and damp. The yard looked unchanged, the grass still flattened where the tarp had covered the sacks days earlier. But as Ethan crossed toward the garage, he noticed something out of place. The side door, which he distinctly remembered locking the night before, was ajar. He stopped a few steps away, heart hammering, and listened. There was no movement inside, no sound beyond the faint hum of insects, waking with the morning. He pushed the door open slowly. The smell inside had changed. The familiar mixture of oil and dust was still there, but beneath it was something sharper, fresher, as though the space had been disturbed recently. The workbench was no longer as he had left it. The items were mostly in place, but one absence stood out immediately. The second sack, the one containing the dog tags and uniform fragments, was gone. Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing. There was no sign of forced entry, no scattered tools or broken locks. Whoever had been here had known exactly what they were looking for and how to leave without drawing attention. The realization struck him with cold clarity. The roof had not been the only place watched over time. The house itself had been known. He searched the garage carefully, then the yard, then the interior of the house, though he already knew the outcome. Nothing else was missing. The envelope, the documents, the videotape were untouched. That selective precision frightened him more than wholesale destruction would have. It meant that someone had assessed the contents and chosen what mattered most to them. By mid-morning, Ethan had come to a conclusion he had resisted since the beginning. The discovery was no longer his to manage alone. Still, he was not ready to involve authorities. Not yet. The thought of exposing his father's actions to official scrutiny stirred a deep unease. The image of his father as a man who had disappeared rather than betray his family clashed painfully with the possibility of headlines, investigations, and public judgment. Instead, Ethan reached out cautiously, starting with a local attorney he knew by reputation. The man listened politely as Ethan spoke in careful, abstract terms, avoiding specifics. The response was measured, professional, and evasive. Without seeing the materials, the attorney said, there was little advice to give. When Ethan hinted at the involvement of military operations and classified documents, the line went quiet for a moment before the attorney suggested, gently but firmly, that Ethan reconsider pursuing the matter at all. A similar pattern repeated itself when Ethan contacted a journalist he had once met through work. At first, there was curiosity, even excitement. But when Ethan described the age of the materials and the level of secrecy involved, enthusiasm cooled quickly. The journalist warned him that stories like this rarely ended with justice, and that the people implicated often retained influence long after the events themselves. The most unsettling conversation came later that afternoon. Ethan reached out to a former military acquaintance of his father's, a man whose name appeared once in the documents, then vanished. The man answered reluctantly and listened in silence as Ethan spoke. When he finally responded, his voice was flat, stripped of warmth. Some things, he said, were buried for a reason. Digging them up did not honor the dead. It endangered the living. Before Ethan could ask more, the call ended. As evening approached, the pressure intensified. Ethan noticed a dark sedan parked down the street, its engine running. It remained there for nearly an hour before pulling away. Later, as he took out the trash, he found footprints near the fence, partially obscured, but unmistakably recent. He began to understand that the removal of the sack had not been a warning. It had been a test. That night, he did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread before him, organizing them, photographing each page, creating digital copies. He labeled files meticulously, storing them on multiple drives. The act was methodical, almost calming. If the truth was going to surface, it would do so intact, resistant to erasure. As the hours passed, Ethan confronted the core of his conflict. To protect his father's memory by remaining silent would mean allowing the crimes documented here to remain unresolved. To speak would dismantle the illusion of a clean past, revealing his father not as a fallen hero, but as a man who had navigated moral ambiguity and paid for it with his life as he had known it. Just before dawn, Ethan reached a quiet clarity. His father had not hidden the truth so that it could be admired in secrecy. He had preserved it so that it could be used. Silence, Ethan realized, was not loyalty. It was complicity. When the sun rose, casting pale light across the worn floorboards, Ethan made the call he had been avoiding. He contacted the nearest field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He spoke plainly, identifying himself, describing the nature of his discovery, and requesting a formal meeting. The response was immediate, professional, and cautious. He was instructed not to move the materials and to expect contact within hours. As Ethan ended the call, he looked around the house, at the walls that had witnessed decades of unspoken tension, at the ceiling beneath which the sacks had rested unnoticed for so long. The decision felt final, irrevocable. Whatever followed, there would be no return to ignorance. Outside, a light breeze stirred the trees, and the house, for the first time since his return, seemed to exhale. The agents arrived just after noon, their presence announced not by sirens or urgency, but by the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to entering spaces where they did not belong and making them theirs. 2 unmarked vehicles stopped at the edge of the property. The men and women who stepped out wore plain clothes, carried no visible weapons, and introduced themselves with calm professionalism. Their voices were steady, their expressions neutral, as though they had already prepared themselves for what they might find. Ethan watched from the porch as they approached. The house behind him felt strangely lighter, as if a weight it had carried for decades had finally shifted. He felt no relief, only a sober awareness that the last line separating his private life from something much larger had just dissolved. Inside, the agents moved methodically. They photographed the roof, the garage, the workbench, the remaining sacks. Every document Ethan had preserved was examined, cataloged, and cross-checked. The videotape was handled with particular care. One of the agents watched portions of it in silence, his face revealing nothing. When he finished, he met Ethan's eyes briefly and nodded once, a gesture that carried more gravity than reassurance ever could. They confirmed what Ethan had already begun to suspect. The materials were authentic. The operations referenced in the documents existed, though under different names and classifications. The individuals mentioned were real, some long retired, some deceased, and some very much alive. The selective removal of the second sack was noted without comment, but Ethan understood its implication clearly. The truth had not been forgotten. It had been guarded. Within hours, the house changed. Evidence markers appeared on the floor. The garage was sealed. The yard became a controlled space. Ethan signed forms he barely read, answering questions that forced him to revisit memories he had never examined closely before. He spoke of his father's habits, his silences, his sudden disappearance. Each answer felt like another thread pulled loose from a tightly woven fabric. As the investigation expanded, Ethan learned more than he had anticipated. The operation his father had been part of had been quietly reclassified years after it ended, its failures absorbed into other narratives. The men who had orchestrated it had dispersed into different sectors, carrying their influence with them. Accountability had never been pursued because it had never been demanded by anyone with sufficient authority. Until now. The name of Ethan's father appeared in internal discussions not as a casualty, but as an anomaly, a participant who had not followed the expected trajectory. His disappearance, once a convenient explanation, was re-examined as an act of defiance rather than loss. The documents he had hidden filled gaps that official records had carefully avoided. For Ethan, the days that followed blurred together. He stayed in a small hotel while the house remained under federal control. Reporters began calling, though no story had yet been published. He declined interviews, understanding that the truth did not need embellishment. It would speak for itself. When the agents finally allowed him to return to the house, it felt different. Not emptied, but clarified. The spaces were the same, yet the silence had changed character. It was no longer heavy or guarded. It was simply quiet. The investigation moved forward without spectacle. There were no dramatic arrests, no public confessions. Instead, there were resignations, sealed indictments, quiet removals from advisory boards and private institutions. Files were reopened. Names were corrected. Histories amended, though never fully rewritten. Ethan received a formal letter weeks later. It stated that his father's status had been officially revised. He was no longer listed as missing in action. He was recognized as a witness who had acted to preserve evidence of criminal activity at significant personal cost. There was no mention of heroism, no language of redemption, just acknowledgement. That was enough. On a clear afternoon, Ethan climbed back onto the roof. The opening beneath the tiles had already been documented, photographed, and cleared. The space where the sacks had rested was empty now, exposed to light for the first time in decades. He replaced the boards, laid fresh insulation, and fitted new slate carefully into place. The work was slower this time, deliberate, almost reverent. As he worked, he thought of his father not as the man who had vanished, but as the man who had stayed, invisibly, within the structure of the house itself. Not haunting it, but anchoring it, ensuring that what needed to endure would do so. When the last tile was set, Ethan stepped back and looked across the roofline. There was no sign of what had been hidden there. No marker, no scar. Just a roof doing what it had always done, sheltering what lay beneath. He descended the ladder and stood in the yard, listening to the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood. Children laughed somewhere down the street. A lawnmower started up and then stopped. Life continued, indifferent to the weight of truth that had briefly surfaced and settled again into a different form. The house no longer kept secrets. It no longer needed to. It had fulfilled its purpose, holding the truth until someone was ready to hear it and strong enough to carry it forward. Ethan went inside and closed the door behind him, not to shut the past out, but to live with it honestly. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. If you want to see how this story connects to others like it, subscribe to the channel. Watch the next video and explore the rest of the stories already on the channel. Share this video with someone who enjoys hidden truths and real consequences.